Most of us learned in school that American slavery ended with abolition, and that importing enslaved people was banned after 1808. But what textbooks don't reveal is that this wasn't the end. It was the start of something even more chilling. Enslavers in Virginia and Maryland turned childbirth itself into the backbone of their fortunes, creating so-called breeding states, where thousands of enslaved people were sold as human products to the Deep South. Some families were torn apart before children reached their 8th birthday, all meticulously recorded in ledgers valuing each new life in dollars. The story behind these 10 shocking facts about slave breeding is one schools tried desperately to bury. But why did this hidden system become so central to America's wealth, and what did it really cost? In the decades after 1808, Virginia and Maryland became known as the breeding states of the Upper South. With the international slave trade cut off, enslavers there faced a new reality. Their fortunes now depended on the bodies of the people they already owned. In places where tobacco no longer paid, enslaved children born in Virginia and Maryland became the region's most profitable export. Traders and planters calculated every birth, every body, as part of a business model that treated human beings as capital. Between 1820 and 1860, Virginia's enslaved population grew from just over 425,000 to nearly 491,000, a modest increase compared to the boom in the Deep South, but enough to supply a steady stream of people for sale. Maryland, by contrast, saw its enslaved population decline from more than 107,000 to just over 87,000. The numbers tell a story of forced migration. As many as 300,000 people were uprooted from Virginia alone and shipped south, most of them through commercial trade. Shipping manifests, bills of sale, and plantation records tracked these transactions with chilling precision. Enslaved men, women, and children were marched in coffles or packed onto steamships, sent from Richmond or Baltimore to the markets of Natchez and New Orleans. By the 1850s, Richmond's biggest business wasn't tobacco or iron, but the sale of people. An enslaved child born in Virginia might be sold for the equivalent of $50,000 today, their value rising with every mile they traveled south. The scale of this internal slave trade reshaped the entire economy of the Upper South. Surplus labor became the region's chief commodity, and the wealth generated from these sales rivaled profits from any crop. Some counties in Maryland and Virginia lost a quarter or more of their enslaved population in a single decade. At the same time, the Deep South's cotton fields filled with people whose only connection to their new homes was a price tag. This forced migration didn't just move bodies, it tore apart families and communities, all in pursuit of profit. The ledgers kept by traders and planters reveal the cold arithmetic behind every sale. For those left behind, every birth was shadowed by the knowledge that a child could be sold at any moment, their fate sealed by demand hundreds of miles away. In the breeding states, human life itself became the most valuable crop. In colonial Virginia, a single law changed the fate of generations. The 1662 Statute of Partus Sequitur Ventrum decreed that every child born to an enslaved woman would inherit her status, regardless of the father's identity. This legal doctrine broke from English tradition, which usually traced a child's status through the father. Instead, it made the womb itself a source of property. The law was simple, but its consequences were devastating. Every birth meant new wealth for the enslaver, and every pregnancy was a legal guarantee of profit. Plantation records and court inventories from the 18th and 19th centuries reveal how this law shaped daily life. In probate appraisals, enslaved women of childbearing age, often labeled as breeders or breeding women, were valued above others. Their price reflected not only their ability to work, but their potential to produce more enslaved children. Appraisers listed the number of children each woman had, and sometimes even noted the ages of her offspring, calculating future returns like a livestock ledger. The incentive structure was clear. The more children an enslaved woman bore, the more valuable she became to the estate. Legal records from Virginia, Maryland, and South Carolina show that women who had proven fertility were sold for higher sums. In one 1820s inventory, a woman named Dinah was appraised at nearly double the value of a man her age because she had 5 living children. On another plantation, a woman's worth was explicitly tied to the number of children she had produced in the previous decade. This legal framework gave enslavers a direct financial motive to force pregnancies. It also erased any legal recognition of paternity or family ties among the enslaved. Fathers had no rights to their children, and the law recognized only the mother's status as property. The courts enforced these rules with chilling efficiency. In disputes over inheritance, judges examined breeding records and sales ledgers to determine the value of enslaved estates, often down to the number of infants and pregnant women. By encoding reproduction into property law, partus sequitur ventrem turned sexual violence into a business strategy. The forced pregnancies that followed were not just tolerated, they were protected and monetized by the law itself. The result was a system where every child born into slavery deepened the wealth of the enslaver, and every enslaved woman's body became a site of legal and economic exploitation. Plantation ledgers in the Deep South recorded more than just names and ages. They tracked pregnancies, births, and bloodlines with the same detail reserved for livestock. Enslaved girls, some as young as 13, were entered into these stud books when their bodies first allowed it. The records show a relentless math. One woman, 10 to 15 pregnancies, each child a line item in the estate's future profits. A woman's value was measured in the number of healthy children she produced, and the pressure to bear more was constant. WPA interviews decades later recalled how enslavers selected certain men as stock, forcing them to father children with multiple women, regardless of any bond or desire. On some plantations, these men were called stockmen, or studs, chosen for their strength and kept apart from their own families. Harriet Jacobs, enslaved in North Carolina, wrote about the terror of being forced into motherhood by her owner. In her words, "No pen can give an adequate description of the all-pervading corruption produced by slavery." She described girls becoming mothers before they could claim their own childhoods, their pregnancies not a matter of choice, but of command. The UPA narratives echo her story. One woman's mother was kept from sale because she brought fine children and was paired with the plantation's chosen breeding man. Another recalled being locked in a barn, stripped of dignity, and left with others to raise children for the master. These practices weren't hidden from the record books. Some plantations kept detailed lists, marking down each birth, the names of mothers and fathers, the dates, and sometimes even the physical traits of the newborns. A girl's first pregnancy, often at 13 or 14, was just the beginning. The ledgers reveal a pattern of repeated pregnancies, sometimes a dozen or more, with little concern for the woman's health or wishes. The cold arithmetic of these records leaves no doubt. Reproduction was managed, measured, and enforced. Behind every number was a life shaped and broken by a system that reduced human beings to breeding stock. In the heart of the slave markets, a separate economy thrived, one that traded not just in labor, but in sexuality. Advertisements in New Orleans and Richmond newspapers listed women as fancy maids, chambermaids, or simply quadroon girls. But the coded language was widely understood. These were young, light-skinned women and girls, often described as bright mulatto or octoroon, singled out for their appearance and sold specifically for sexual exploitation. The market for so-called fancy girls operated in the open, with bills of sale and auction broadsides listing their ages, complexions, and supposed virtues. The price tags told their own story. In 1818, a 12-year-old quadroon named Chloe was sold for $1,800, more than the $1,250 paid for prime male field hands at the same auction. In Louisville, a trader bragged about selling a devilish pretty quadroon wench for $9,000 in the early 1850s, a sum that dwarfed the going rate for nearly any other enslaved person. Most sales didn't reach such extremes, but even routine transactions showed a clear premium. In New Orleans, light-skinned women consistently brought 5 to 11% more than their darker-skinned counterparts. The difference wasn't just in the numbers, it was in the way these women were displayed, dressed in fine clothes and jewelry, paraded before buyers whose interest had nothing to do with fieldwork. The business of the fancy trade was deliberate and public. Auctioneers advertised a very superior, bright mulatto girl, aged 15 years, with fine figure and manners. Some traders specialized in this market, transporting fancy girls from as far as Maryland and Virginia to the Deep South, where demand was highest. Buyers included wealthy planters, politicians, and merchants, men willing to pay many times the average price for a woman whose skin was almost white. The most sought after were described as nearly white, their value measured by the degree to which they could pass for a free woman or even the daughter of their purchaser. The records don't just reveal prices, they expose the logic of the trade. The lighter the complexion, the higher the bid. Girls as young as 10 or 11 were auctioned as fancy, their youth and vulnerability adding to their market appeal. The sexual commodification of these women and girls was so normalized that it shaped the language and structure of the market itself. In New Orleans, the sale of fancy girls became so lucrative that it was considered a distinct branch of the slave trade, with its own brokers and regular clientele. Behind each transaction was a life upended. These women were separated from their families, stripped of any chance at safety or autonomy, and forced into a world where their value lay in their ability to satisfy the desires of white men. The profits from these sales flowed into the pockets of traders and planters, fueling an economy built on sexual violence. The fancy trade was not a footnote. It was a central, profitable enterprise, openly advertised and carefully documented, revealing just how far the market for human beings could go. Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence and third President of the United States, kept meticulous records of his plantation's operations. In his farm book, Jefferson tracked the births of enslaved children at Monticello with the same care he gave to crops and livestock. His private correspondence reveals a chilling calculation. In 1820, he wrote, "I consider a woman who brings a child every 2 years as more profitable than the best man of the farm. What she produces is an addition to the capital." For Jefferson, every birth meant more wealth. Children born to enslaved women increased his holdings, their lives measured in future earnings. This was not an isolated view among Virginia's elite. Letters between Jefferson and fellow planters discuss the natural increase of their enslaved populations as a source of reliable profit, especially after the 1808 ban on the international slave trade. Jefferson's friend John Hartwell Cocke described how slave owners in Virginia believed their profits consist in the increased number and value of their slaves, not in the crops they grew. Detailed ledgers from Monticello show that women of childbearing age were tracked for their fertility, with notes on how often they gave birth and the survival of their children. A 2-year interval between births was considered ideal for maximizing returns. The contradiction between Jefferson's public ideals and his private business practices is stark. He spoke of liberty and equality, but his economic survival depended on the forced reproduction of enslaved women. His records do not mention the violence or coercion behind those numbers, but the arithmetic is unmistakable. Every child born at Monticello was counted as capital, destined for labor or sale. Jefferson's careful accounting reveals how the nation's founding generation turned human reproduction into a business strategy, embedding forced breeding into the very core of American prosperity. On Duke Street in Alexandria, Franklin and Armfield built their empire behind brick walls and iron bars. Their business model was simple: buy children and young adults in Virginia and Maryland, then ship them south in massive groups to the booming markets of Natchez and New Orleans. Boys and girls as young as 8 were separated from their mothers, sold with the promise that their youth meant years of profit ahead. Franklin and Armfield's own policy made it clear children were the most reliable investment. They wrote, "It is best to buy young, for they will last the longest and bring the best prices." By the 1850s, the value of enslaved people had soared. A healthy child could fetch the equivalent of $50,000 today. Traders like Franklin and Armfield dealt in so many lives that their ledgers read like the balance sheets of a Wall Street firm. In 1860, the total value of enslaved people in the United States surpassed $3 billion, more than all the nation's railroads and factories combined. This was not a shadow economy. It was the backbone of American wealth. Children, once weaned, were auctioned in Richmond and shipped in chains to the Deep South. Traders tracked every transaction, every birth, every sale. The forced migration of over 1 million people from the Upper South to the Cotton States was not just a tragedy. It was a business plan executed with ruthless efficiency. Franklin and Armfield alone moved thousands each year, their profits flowing north into banks, factories, and universities. The wealth built on these bodies shaped the fortunes of families and cities for generations, long after the last auction block fell silent. In the shadow of forced reproduction, enslaved women carved out quiet acts of resistance. Across the cotton fields and quarters, knowledge passed from mother to daughter became a shield. Cotton root, dug from the edge of the field, was chewed or brewed into tea, not as a cure, but as a way to prevent pregnancy. WPA interviews decades later recall women whispering about these roots in the dark, hiding them from overseers who punished anyone caught with them. The risks were severe, but so was the determination to reclaim some control over their bodies. Resistance took many forms. Some women stretched out breastfeeding, hoping to delay the next pregnancy. Others feigned illness or reported missed cycles to overseers, buying time away from the heaviest labor. When doctors were called to examine a supposed pregnancy, women sometimes claimed a miscarriage, knowing that the truth was nearly impossible to prove. These small acts added up. Plantation records show suspiciously high numbers of miscarriages and stillbirths, unexplained by disease alone. Solidarity grew in the face of exploitation. Women tended each other through births, shared what herbs to use, and watched over children who might be sold away. Men, too, found ways to resist, refusing to cooperate, sabotaging tools, or working slowly. Some families forged kinship ties that outlasted sale and separation, creating networks of support that stretched across counties and generations. Even in the tightest grip of control, enslaved people found ways to push back. Every hidden root, every whispered warning, was a refusal to be defined by the ledger or the auction block. These acts did not end the system, but they proved that dignity could survive even the harshest attempts to break it. DNA from the iron furnaces of Maryland tells a story that still echoes in living families. In 2023, researchers traced the remains of 27 enslaved people from Catoctin Furnace to over 41,000 living relatives across the United States. Most had African roots, but the Y chromosomes pointed to fathers of European descent. This genetic pattern is not just a scientific curiosity. It's the imprint of generations of sexual violence, of white enslavers fathering children with enslaved women, often by force. The legacy of these breeding systems reaches far beyond family trees. Colorism, judging worth by skin tone, took root in the auction houses where lighter-skinned women and girls, often born from rape, fetched higher prices. In New Orleans, records show that a bright mulatto girl could sell for 10% more than her darker-skinned peers. The scars of that market still shape how beauty, privilege, and pain are negotiated within Black communities today. But the inheritance is more than physical. The forced destruction of families, the trauma of mothers losing children, and fathers denied any claim to their own blood left wounds that run through generations. Psychologists now recognize the symptoms, hypervigilance, mistrust, and grief that cannot be named, as the legacy of a system built on forced breeding. The myths that once justified these crimes, ideas about Black women's bodies as hypersexual, about Black men as studs, still feed stereotypes in American culture and media. For descendants, the past is not buried. It surfaces in family stories, in the search for lost relatives, and in the quiet pain that lingers long after the last auction block fell. The evidence, written in bloodlines and in memory, shows that the machinery of forced reproduction shaped not just the bodies, but the souls of those who survived. Its impact lives on, carried forward in ways both seen and unseen. By 1860, enslaved people in the United States were valued at over $3 billion, more than all the nation's factories and railroads combined. The forced breeding of human beings was not a hidden exception, but a documented business model shaped by laws like the 1662 Statute of Partus Sequitur Ventrem and tracked in plantation breeding books, sales ads, and court records. Families were destroyed, and children as young as 8 were sold as commodities. Despite thousands of pages of evidence and first-hand accounts like those from Harriet Jacobs, many details, such as the full number of breeding farms, remain unrecorded or lost. Today, DNA studies and social patterns like colorism reveal this legacy lives on, shaping communities and identities. The historical record shows how profit and policy made human suffering routine, and why understanding these facts is essential to confronting slavery's enduring impact on American life.